Hey, everybody, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we're going to pick up right where we left off yesterday, talking about the differences between slavery in the more recent past, the last few hundred years, the transatlantic slave trade, and slavery in the classical world, which was also bad, but bad in different ways. And there's no escaping the fact that the institution of slavery is assumed throughout the text of the Bible. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily affirmed throughout the text of the Bible. And certainly the abuses and evils and violence that we see associated with slavery over the centuries, it's incompatible with the values of the kingdom. We're going to have a tough time understanding what the Bible means every time the notion of servanthood or slavery comes up in the text, if we imagine slavery in the antebellum South. Because, again, while both were horrible practices, they were different flavors of slavery. And I guess my assumption moving forward in the argument, I suppose, do I make arguments in these episodes? I don't know if you count it that way. If we're going to use that language, though, the argument I'm going to make here is that the antebellum South was worse. So what are the differences between more recent slavery and slavery back in the day? In the classical Greek world, for example, it doesn't look like there was a racial component, at least primarily, to slavery. That wasn't the division between slaves and masters like it was in the antebellum South. It looks like the division there had to do with the mind. There was this notion of moral deficiency, an inability to think morally or ethically or philosophically about the natural world and what makes a person that slaves had, that masters did not. And so it was their duty in society to supervise and provide some sort of useful life for people who were morally inferior and incapable of leading a household or others. The Greeks and the Romans also had another built-in set of assumptions that they could point to keep from feeling like they were inflicting slave treatment on their peers, on people just like them. And that was the Greek and eventually Roman cosmology of deities. This is your Zeus and Hera and Triton and Hermes and even demigods like Hercules and Perseus. And the idea here is that these gods would come along and they would mess with stuff and they would bump up the fortunes of the favored and punish those they didn't like very much. I mean, what can you do? It's the will of the gods. And so there was a little bit of ridiculous theological underpinning to some of the institution of slavery in Greece as well. Now, some of the city-states in Greece, because remember, Greece, it wasn't a country, it was a culture, it was a region, it was shared social and linguistic patterns across a bunch of little kingdom cities scattered all around the Aegean Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. And so there was going to be variety in terms of how cruelly slaves were treated and how people became slaves. But the most obvious ways that it happened were through piracy. People would go on raids and take folks who didn't have any ability to really defend themselves or their holdings and make them slaves. Also, the spoils of war thing, like it's a gesture of mercy not to just slaughter all of your opponents, right? You make them slaves. Instead, they get to keep living. Maybe even they can have kids someday, even though those kids will be slaves as well. Or someone could become a slave as a product of terrible decision-making, business misfortune. Or, even more strangely, someone might become a slave because of political missteps or political misfortune. Cancellation in those days could eliminate all of one's abilities to participate in society monetarily. And so there's some super brilliant scholar who suggests that being forced into slavery in the Greek or Roman world was effectively social death. You're still alive, you're still eating food, but you're no longer a player in the game. And so for the Greeks, again, this notion of moral inferiority is what separated the slave from the master. In Roman culture, it was social inferiority that separated the slave from the master. These old Roman houses had been around for centuries and centuries by the time of Jesus. And if you were born into one of those noble houses, it meant that you had noble blood that also coursed through the veins of your brilliant ancestors who were victorious in business and war and politics. And so it was your birthright to be in a position of authority and a position of ownership over others. But some people didn't have such luck with their social standing, or maybe they had it and they squandered it, And as a result, some sort of lower class or even slave class was a possibility. So it would make sense that the lie they would tell themselves in order to morally justify slavery would be that there really is some intrinsic thing that gives someone social value, and that a few people have that, but most people don't. And those who really lack it, well, it's better to make them a slave than to kill them, I guess. So in Greek culture, slavery is a moral division between master and slave. In Roman culture, it's a social division between master and slave. But in the antebellum South, in the transatlantic slave trade, it's entirely racial. And all of the other stuff is just piled on and assumed above and beyond that. It's just stone cold, hard racism. And you can go and try and make a case that there was some sort of racial element to Greek and Roman slavery. I mean, certainly ethnic minorities outside of Italians and Greeks were made slaves, and there was very little racial sensitivity in the Mediterranean world. I mean, people viewed whoever they were as being the superior group of people with the superior gods and the superior ideas, and everybody else is a barbarian or an idiot. And you see all over classical literature making fun of how everybody else looks and how everybody else sounds, but also money brought everybody together. The Mediterranean world overwhelmingly engaged in free trade, and people made each other rich. And as a result, there was a whole bunch of people from all the corners of the world who participated freely and publicly with great aplomb and celebration in Roman culture and Greek culture and Persian culture, Egyptian culture. It was a very cosmopolitan place. Whereas I'm not sure the same thing could be said about the antebellum South. Pretty clearly, there was racial stratification there. That racial stratification was impermeable. There seems to have been still little, yet by comparison, much more permeability to the boundary of slave and free person in classical world slavery than there was in the transatlantic slave trade in the antebellum South. Another distinction worth noting between more recent slavery and classical world slavery is that it really was pretty frowned upon to be just awful to your slaves. The expectation was a slave who is educated is going to be a more effective slave or household servant. There's all kinds of potential here to be tapped into. Investing in their well-being, in their physical health, in their education was more of an expectation amongst the Roman and Greek elites than it was in the American South. And because of that glimmer of hope that your fortunes could change as an individual or as a family, you could work your way out of slavery. You could be reintegrated into society. You could be socially resurrected, brought back from the dead, and invited to play once again. I think that had to have had a tremendous psychological effect on the slave class in general and how the slave class was thought of. Slaves, yes. Owned, yes. Registered property, yes. But they might not be tomorrow because it wasn't as simple as just a racial line drawn in the sand. Whereas slavery in the antebellum South seemed to have come with just pure, raw, unending, nurtured, intentional, inflicted despair. In Jesus' time, there was an entire, very well-regarded class of people known as freedmen, and we even see mention of a synagogue of the freedmen in the book of Acts. So these populations apparently assembled together to some extent. They no doubt found collegiality in their former state of servitude, but also these were people who were able to pretty much completely participate in Roman society at the time of Jesus. Further, whereas the treatment of slaves in the American South, when you go back and actually read firsthand accounts, apparently the cruelty knew roughly no boundaries. By comparison, we see several legal reforms in Greek city-states and in the Roman Republic and Roman Empire. And so some of those reforms include some restrictions being placed on owners and masters, which means that there were some legal limits in place to the claim of ownership over another person in the classical world that maybe weren't in place at the height of slavery in the American South. I'm getting tight on time, so let me just land the plane saying this. I think the two key distinctions that need to be highlighted here is that recent slavery has a racial divide. Classical slavery had different divides between master and servant. Recent slavery was filled with absolute despair, and that was on purpose. Classical world slavery, it was bad, but there was this lingering possibility of being reintegrated into society, earning your freedom for you and your family. And there were even opportunities to play respected roles in society involving working with money and property and business that might be afforded a slave in the classical world. And so it would seem to me that the very notion of slave in the classical world, though still not a positive one, had a bit more hope, optimism, and slightly higher standing to it than the notion of slave in the darkest days of slavery in the American South. Hopefully that is helpful in thinking through the differences between the two. We'll get back to Matthew 24, where Jesus is using the Greek word for slave in this little parable that we've been checking in on over the last few days, and connect the dots between what Jesus is saying and the comparison we just got done doing between recent slavery and classical slavery. I super appreciate that you are willing to go with me where the text takes us. I think that's important. I think it gives us the best shot in understanding what this thing is actually saying. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10 Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.